crazy technology will work. All right. Hello, everybody. We are here with a little different episode from our normal fare on the Into the Impossible podcast. I don't know why my rabbinical guest is not showing up. Let me try this one more time. Maybe I need to add. How do I do this? This is the real thing I should figure out before I start. Let's see here. Let me go to a different screen here. There's a way to do this. I believe it's in Skype. Let me go to Skype over here. Let me go to settings on Skype. Audio and video. We got some crying babies in the background, but that's okay. It's all freewheeling here. Let's see. I'm trying to get you up on the screen, Rabbi. That's just taking me 1 second to remind myself how to do this. Yeah, exactly. Where are we going to go? It's a pandemic. We're not going to go anywhere. Let's see. NDI. Skype guest NDI. Let me do that. Let's see. Now I don't see anybody. Include Skype guest NDI. Yeah, that's weird. Happy Hanukkah, everybody. Give me 1 second. I'm try and figure this out on the fly. Ecamm is not letting me do this, but I've solved it before. Skype, NDI. How do I do that? Remote guest via Skype. This will all be edited out, Rabbi. Don't worry. This will be edited out in post-production. Open Skype preferences in the calling section. That's what I forgot. Calling. Let's see. Only allow calling advanced. Allow NDI usage. There we go. If this doesn't do it, nothing will. And there you are. Beautiful, Rabbi. Hello, sir.
Hi there.
Now we are live. And I'm going to add myself back in. I'm going to remove you. I'm going to switch this around. Now we're going to add in the rabbi. Boom. There we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the special Hanukkah Miracle of Lights and Miracle of Technology with America's Rabbi. This is Rabbi David Wolpe. Thank you so much for joining us on the Into the Impossible podcast. This is your second appearance on our show.
Indeed. Becoming a regular.
Yeah, what do they call it? A Hazaka or whatever when it's 3 times?
Hazaka.
We'll do that. Exactly. We'll do Pesach. We'll do a Pesach serenade or a Purim serenade. Hopefully we can get it all done. So tonight I wanted to do, in honor of this being the first night of Hanukkah, I wanted to kind of get some of my questions answered, but also to answer some questions of the viewers, including some of these very erudite people that I get to speak to on the Into the Impossible podcast. And you should know that you were actually, you're being sandwiched. You're part of a sandwich between 2 Nobel Prize winners. So, I figure if they have to live up to your reputation, to your...
Exactly, sure.
So I had on multiple Nobel Prize winners. And this week and tomorrow. And it's just such a treat that I get to have you here. And I thought we would begin with, first of all, dispelling some myths about Hanukkah. The first one that I get from Nobel caliber intellects is that Hanukkah is Jewish Christmas, and that it came about, as basically a response to Christmas, so that little Jewish boys and girls like me would be happy with a pair of slacks or something when their friends from other religions were getting huge Matchbox car sets to dwarf my slack. But anyway, is it just Jewish Christmas?
Well, that would be a better argument if in fact it didn't predate the birth of Jesus by several hundred years, or at least a few hundred years. In fact, it was about the struggle. It's post-biblical. But it's in that sort of interregnum, in the time between the close of the Bible and the Talmudic or Christian era, depending on how you look at it. And what happened was that the Seleucids, the Greeks, and the Jews battled over the sovereignty of Jerusalem, and also Jews battled with themselves. Hanukkah is a little bit of a civil war, as well as being a fight for religious liberty, because. As always, as is always the case, the minority culture starts to disappear into the majority culture, and the Maccabees were fighting to retain the integrity of Judaism in a Hellenized world. So the truth is that Hanukkah has absolutely nothing to do with Christmas. However, having said that, it also has become in America particularly salient because it happens at the same time as Christmas. So we shouldn't pretend, oh, one thing has nothing to do with the other. In fact, we know that for people in a Christian culture, because they're both winter holidays, because they both involve light and the darkness, because they come at the same time, it has become more important in the Jewish calendar than it really is in the Jewish calendar. It is a relatively minor holiday, but it's become important because it happens at the same time as Christmas.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's natural that one might expect them to sort of take on similar sorts of, at least appeal or notoriety in the minds of both adherents and non-adherents. And actually, I was under the impression that, that it came later than Christmas for some reason. But of course, it couldn't really, right? Because the actual story is very deep, and I think it makes for an interesting story, at least in my mind, that I view Hanukkah as sort of preserving Western civilization or Western, at least freedom of religion in some sense, and monotheism, because of really the ancient Greeks, disdain for the Jewish culture. And actually, the story I always remember hearing, and this is one of the Talmudic disputes that we can discuss, but I remember thinking as a kid, okay, so let's say I have a gas tank in my car, and it only has enough to get home and 1 mile to drive 1 mile, and I live 8 miles away.
Right.
And all right, so maybe I miscalculated. What is the nature of this miracle that's publicized by lighting menorahs? What does the menorah have to do with it?
So I would say, first of all, two things. The menorah, the original menorah, was in the temple, but it had seven really, because of the center piece. Wicks, I suppose. And that's why some people don't like calling the Chanukiah a menorah, because it's not exactly the same as a menorah. But I just want to say that anybody who, if you say a menorah and they correct you, they're being a little pedantic, okay? It's like, you can call it a menorah.
Jews be pedantic? You don't say.
Exactly.
You don't say.
If you want to be really correct, you can call it a Hanukkah menorah, but you don't have to. So
that's like when somebody says, "Oh, I love Rabbi Wolpe. He's one of my favorite Jewish rabbis." I say,
exactly.
Are there other kinds?
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Are there other kinds? However, what I've always found interesting, the story of the miracle, first of all, is a later story. We don't find it in the original story of the Maccabees. But let us assume that was in fact the miracle. What interests me and what goes to your point is, so it was supposed to last for one night, and it lasted for 8 nights. And therefore, we light 8 nights of a miracle. But the truth is, we should only light for 7 nights. Because if it was supposed to last for one night, then only 7 nights were a miracle, not all 8 nights. And this is a question that was already asked by in the 1500s, I believe, by Joseph Caro, and a lot of answers have been given, but I actually think that the answer is what you say, which is that the great miracle is that after the destruction or the near destruction, the trashing of the temple and so on and so forth, they still wanted to light, that Judaism survived it all. So in a sense, the first night is the great miracle, and the fact that we still light thousands of years later is the miracle. So I find Hanukkah be a very inspiring holiday because, as you say, it is the assertion of a minority culture that what we believe, which is sacred to us, should be preserved and can't be overrun simply because it's not what the majority believes. And that theme has been sort of the leitmotif of Jewish history.
Yeah. Because
we've always been a minority, at least most of our history. And the only place we haven't been a minority is in Israel. Mm-hmm. So, and even there at times we were a minority because we were expelled. As a result, Hanukkah is deeply thematic and important.
And the menorah too. I remember a story, and Rabbi, you must know this better than me, but of a sage who wanted very much to go to Rome, and he wanted to go to the Arch of Titus to see it. And I remember the story goes something like this. He goes to the Arch of Titus. He's an old man, a very old rabbi, and he goes to the Arch of Titus, and he looks at it, and he screams like, "I am here," in Yiddish. "I am here. Where are you, Rufus? Where are you?" In other words, the Jewish culture, the Jews have survived. And, I'm not prone to believe in miracles. It doesn't come easy to me as a scientist. But the existence of such a people, throughout history, despite how many times we've been tried to be annihilated and overwhelmed and overcome, and that we've endured, and thanks to the tradition of teachers like you and others, that this has been maintained. But really, there is no Greek culture. I mean, they're Greeks, and I have many good friends that are, but they don't practice the same culture, the same, So go ahead.
And they don't read ancient Greek as a modern language, whereas any school child can read the Bible in Israel. And I want to say something about that in a second. But first, let me just, to those of your listeners who don't know what you mean by the Arch of Titus, that it preserves in stone Roman soldiers carrying the menorah from the temple.
Yeah.
Because it was an act of triumph. We destroyed your temple, and here's the menorah. And of course, I have to say, when I first saw it, I felt the same thing as that old guy, which is, guess what? Here I am. I'm a Jew. Thousands of years later, the Roman Empire is fallen and gone, and we're still here. It reminds me of a wonderful story of Saul Bellow, the Nobel Prize-winning writer, Jewish American writer, who when he went to Israel, I think he tells the story in his book, To Jerusalem and Back. He meets Shai Agnon, who was the first Israeli Nobelist, along with a poet named Nelly Sachs, in '64. And Agnon says to Bellow, look, some people knew Agnon, but Bellow was really world famous, and he wrote English not because he wrote in English. So Agnon says to Bellow, "Are your novels translated into Hebrew?" And Bellow says, "Yes, they are." And Agnon says, "Oh, thank God, you're safe." Because as far as Agnon was concerned, English could come and go, but Hebrew's going to be here in 1,000 years. And if you're not translated into Hebrew, you could be gone.
Yeah, it's really true. The perseverance of it as a people and as a culture, and basically that you could be teleported back, to Jerusalem, to the shtetl in Europe, and you could get along, with the weekly services and the holiday services. You would know what to say, and even bring down some interesting factoids that have been transmitted through our tradition for thousands of years. It's
quite
amazing.
Remarkable.
Yeah.
Right? The continuity of that is really, and I think all the time when I read the Hebrew Bible and it talks about, the Hittites and the Jebusites, and I think the only reason anybody knows these people who are much, much larger than the Jewish people is because they were enemies of the Jews or because they had some contact with the Jews.
Right.
And so that's the only reason we remember that. And I have to say, it is a historical miracle. Take that naturalistically or supernaturalistically, however you want.
Yeah. And so, from the perspective of looking at, the culture that we are a part of and the activity of it, I think it's sort of a miracle also that when you look at those stories, people have to realize that the Hittites, and when the Ammonites and so forth that are talked about, like I used to gloss over this, well, why do we need to learn about these kings and about, but I realized that it's pretty astounding. It would be like we're writing a story about, the Jews, and when we're talking about like people in Germany and how the Jews got along with it, that would actually testify to the authenticity of a document when you put in that Jews weren't always enemies of these different peoples, or the Canaanites and whatever, and actually they intermarried and so forth. And the question of how accurate is this document, and sometimes I think that's why it's in the Torah, to give us not a history lesson but just a test to the accuracy and authenticity of this document.
There's no question about the fact that for much of the story of the Torah, Jews were assimilating as opposed to conquering or at odds with. And one of the ways you know that is because the prophets were always yelling at them about it. They're always saying, "Don't lose."
the upcoming new month is coming next week. We enter in, and that's of course when the moon is new. Actually, we have a very interesting celestial event occurring on Monday, which is a total eclipse of the sun, which is visible from Chile. I was supposed to be there.
I certainly hope you're not going to expect me to speak about that.
No, yes, that would be like you asking me to speak give a Devar Torah.
Now we're transgressing on your specialty.
But it is, Rabbi, you'll be interested. That's the one time you know for sure it's Rosh Chodesh, when there's a total eclipse of the sun. And my theory is, and I'm looking to work with some bright students someday about this, but my theory is that the rabbis were said to know, or the ancient Israelites were said to know the length of the month to within a few seconds. And given the technology 3,000 years ago, I find that almost impossible unless they were able to sort of calibrate it and they knew and they understood celestial, at least astronomical events well enough to say that every time there's an eclipse, we know 2 weeks later there'll be a likelihood for a lunar eclipse, and we could actually time it, because otherwise they didn't have watches. Look, Galileo didn't have a watch. Newton barely had a watch. And so you think about how much science was conducted and how did they know the length of, and why is it the lunar calendar that we use as Jews? Why is that instead of the solar calendar?
I don't know it's the Bible uses the lunar calendar. The explanation, and by the way, I think that the Babylonians, who had fairly sophisticated astronomical knowledge, also used the lunar calendar. I can tell you the spiritual meaning of using a lunar calendar, but how it happened historically, I don't know. The spiritual meaning I've always heard is that, as you point out, you declare the new month when the sky is dark, which means that you believe in the promise of the time to come, that it's going to grow lighter and lighter and lighter. Mm. And also I will say, it led to many, over the course of Jewish history, there were many struggles over the exact calendar, because it's very hard to figure out when you have a lunar calendar how to calculate each year when various events are. It's one of the reasons why, for those of you, this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but for those of you who know that outside of the land of Israel, there are 2 days of Yom Tov, 2 days of the beginning and end of a holiday. It's because people weren't sure outside of Israel when the new moon was declared. So it took a little while for to get there, and they wanted to make sure that they covered the right day. Mm. But as I say, the calendrical calculations, I'm going to leave to you.
Yeah. That'll be a thesis.
And the homiletics I'll leave to you.
That's right. If you ever want to pick up your GED in astrophysics, I'm your man, Rabbi.
There you go.
Well, I was in Israel 12, 13, 14 years ago, my first time in Israel on Hanukkah. And I remember, coming back, and on the plane ride home, they were playing, of all movies, they were playing My Big Fat Greek Wedding. It was like 2003 or something. And I remember, I just come back and I just heard about, how the Jews triumphed over the Assyrian Greeks, and how, the word for Greece, or Syria, Greece, sort of has a connotation of darkness. Mm-hmm. And on El Al, they were playing the movie, and there's a scene where he basically goes into a mikveh, the male lead character, and he comes out of the mikveh, and then and he says, "I'm Greek," and I remember the subtitles say it says Mazel Tov, and then it says Ani Yavin, which I just learned is it means you're spiritually dark and you're irredeemably.
In fairness, though, in case you have Greeks
yes.
watching your,
I love
in
Greeks.
Fairness, the Jews took a lot from Greek culture, not as much as Christianity did.
Yes,
Christianity really was a balance of as it used to be said, Hebraism and Hellenism. But Judaism too took quite a bit from Greek culture, and obviously ancient Greek culture enriched the world tremendously. The way that famously Matthew Arnold described the two streams, the stream of Judaism and the stream of Greek culture into Christianity, was that the Greeks believed in the holiness of beauty, and the Jews believed in the beauty of holiness.
Mm. And of course, in America, I see, kind of this union, uniquely so, of Greek attitudes towards, culture, beauty, aesthetics, but also math and science. And some of the words we get in Hebrew, it's funny, like I always knew from my Israeli friends that the only curse words in Hebrew are from other languages. And even the word for like heretic in Hebrew is like apikoros, which is like Epicurean, which is like, which is
really a Greek word.
Yeah. And, but I also, then I'll point out gematria, which is like geometry, comes from Greek as well. So I think there are very interesting similarities and differences, as I might have said to you once before. People ask me about, well, like the Torah and science, are they in conflict? And I say, well, science in Latin, and obviously the Romans derived a lot from the Greeks, means knowledge, but it doesn't mean wisdom. And Torah means more of a sense of wisdom and the connotation thereof. And even the way that we teach it, like a teacher like Ptolemy or Socrates, very different than a rabbi. A rabbi is sort of like, and even the word for teacher, I believe, is similar to the word for parent in Hebrew. Isn't that correct, Rabbi?
Well,
moreh and morah.
Morah, or teacher, and you're supposed to give the same honor to your teacher that you do to a parent.
Yeah. Yes. So I think that love of wisdom, the love of learning are common between them. And then, of course, we don't want religious, kind of governance. But otherwise, I think, America is this beautiful, wonderful, they call it the Golden Medina, right? In Yiddish.
So you have Horim and Morim. You have parents and teachers.
Yeah.
I mean, it is also, I think it is also true that cultures tend to define themselves in opposition to the people that they're around.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there was also a certain amount of pushback. It's one of the reasons, by the way, people don't think about this. Why is the Jewish Sabbath on Saturday, the Christian Sabbath on Sunday, and the Muslim Sabbath on Friday? Because when Christians wanted to distinguish themselves from Jews, they changed the day. When Muslims wanted to distinguish themselves from Christians and Jews, they changed the day or adopted a different day. Everybody, and Jews have done that in reaction as well. Everybody says, well, you want to know what I am? I'm not this. I'm not this. That's what I am.
That's right.
We define both by ourselves and also by others. It's inevitable. We're social creatures.
Yeah, we define ourselves by our neighbors. It's like Canadians feel closer to Mexicans than to Americans, and we like Guatemala. I don't know.
That's right.
So we got some questions for you about is it true that string theory is related to sit-seat? No, I made that up. We're not going to go there. Susan Murray is wondering, what ethnicity is Rabbi Wolpe?
Jewish.
So now,
if you want to know my ancestry, my name comes almost certainly from a small town called Wolpe outside of Warsaw, in Lithuania. Vilna, outside in Lithuania.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, if you go online, you can see the Wolpe Synagogue, which was a famous wooden synagogue. Some of my family went to South Africa, some came to the United States, some went to Israel, and Russia, Poland, all Eastern European Jewish. In fact, when I took my 23andMe, my DNA test, my daughter was somewhat disappointed to learn that I really had a very unexotic background. It was just almost all, it was like 98 or 99% Eastern European Jewish, though there was a small percent, like 0.6% of some Celtic tribe that had an affinity to the Vikings. So I'm holding on to that.
Interesting.
As my warrior side.
I said that once, to my dad. I took a genetic test and I was 99.7% Ashkenazi Jew. And he said, but you're 100% genetic garbage. And then I said, well, somebody else said, like, I'm 99%, Sephardic, but 1% Ashkenazi. I said, well, nobody's perfect.
Somewhere back there, somebody, somebody,
Right. So, but it is true. You said ethnicity kind of as a joke. You're Jewish, but it is true. It's like we as Jews, I converted to Catholicism. I was actually an altar boy. Instead of getting a bar mitzvah at age 13, I was an altar boy in the Catholic Church because my mother married an Irish Catholic man, and I married into their family and actually have his name. I would talk about Irish Catholic. My last name Keating isn't Hebrew. It's Irish and means actually kite flyer in Norwegian / Irish. So you and I could have, really the old country united.
Exactly.
But they say that I never left Judaism. How is that? How can I not have left it? Don't I have to do something to come back to it?
So this is a very interesting, and this is one of those questions that is deeply impacted by history. There is a phrase in the Talmud, Yisrael af al pi shechata Yisrael, which means an Israelite, even if he sins, remains an Israelite. And originally the meaning was, look, everybody sins, everybody does bad things. You can be Jewish and you can sin, you're still Jewish. It doesn't mean you don't have to repent, but you're Jewish. However, during the Spanish Inquisition, when many Jews converted under penalty of death, then later, after the Inquisition waned, rabbis wanted to make it easy for Jews to return to Judaism because otherwise they were afraid they would lose a whole generation. So they used that phrase, an Israelite, even if he sins, remains an Israelite, to say you can't convert out of Judaism. Even if you convert, you remain Jewish and all you really have to do is come back. So as a result, halachically speaking legally, if somebody is born Jewish or converts to Judaism, they remain Jewish for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
In practical terms, sometimes people have asked for a symbolic to go to the mikveh, or honestly, organically, the community has rejected people if they adopt a different religion and stick with it. So if somebody, for example, who was born Jewish and came into my synagogue and was a practicing Christian, asked to be called up to the Torah, I would say that's not appropriate. That's for Jews who identify and are practicing as Jews. But if they said to me, but legally am I not Jewish, I would have to say, yes, legally you are.
Yeah, and that's maybe another way that Jews identify via the negation or distinction of another culture. When you're Christian, you're not Christian if you deny that Jesus Christ is a savior or something like this. And so...
Well, I was going to say, this is a question I get all the time, and I want to emphasize it because I get Jews and Christians, for example, who want to intermarry and don't understand this distinction, which is that Judaism is not a religion in the sense of Christianity, as you correctly point out. If tomorrow I come on your podcast and I say, oh, you know, all that Jewish stuff I believed yesterday, I was wrong. It's all wrong. I'm still equally Jewish, because what Judaism is a religious family. You're born into a family, you can enter a family, but the only way you actually can leave a family is if you consciously choose another family and reject your own. So, as I said, organically, if you choose another religion, Judaism more or less declares you not Jewish, even though legally you are. That's not true with Christianity, because it's not familial. It's belief-based.
Yeah. I was taken in, and just as if my step, grandmother, she thought that the conversion to Catholicism meant like I genetically became, like she started to say like, you should get your doctor to check this gene. That I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm like, it doesn't quite work that way, Grandma. But of course it's, I think, there are different approaches to it, and people, I used to be more sort of thinking about, well, how can somebody, convert and get married? I have intermarried couples in my family. Obviously, my mother married a non-Jew, her second marriage. And I think, at different times, people, as Jews, someone's asking about the maternal bloodline. Why is that the important side of things? So maybe you'll take that. But then I want to ask, your impression about, for a long time I felt, well, like we should, look, as the Talmud does, turn away the attempted convert 3 times, I think is the rule. But that's led to a lot of problems in Jewish history, as I'm sure you know. Yeah. And so first of all, I want to get
why. I don't think people do that today. The attitude towards conversion varied, again, historically, with what the prevailing culture around it was like. And even, by the way, although this may sound strange to some of your listeners, even with whether converts were suspected of being spies or not for the government. Because in Jewish history, children were kidnapped and raised in other cultures and were taken away to the army when they were young and came back and knew nothing of it. It's endless how many ways that predominantly Christian, but in some ages Muslim culture, tried to eliminate Jewish culture. It is a sad fact of history, and I think it's important to say that in terms of interfaith relations in general, we live in what is a golden age to the extent that we can't imagine what it used to be like.
No, we're so spoiled. Yeah.
So yes, although unfortunately that doesn't mean that anti-Semitism has disappeared.
No.
The reason that it went through the mother was because the simplest explanation is because you always knew who the mother was. You didn't know who the father was. You didn't know if the father was Jewish or not. A child is born, you know the child is born of the mother. You don't know whether the child is born of the father.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's...
and I think one other myth is, it's obvious that, I hear often said that, it's not clear if Jesus existed, let alone was a Jew. And one of the things that's most predominant about the Jews is how meticulous we are about writing and about kind of record keeping. There's a reason I think, many Jews went into accounting and science even. And part of that is that they were meticulous. So not only do we know that Jesus was a rabbi, I believe we know who his rabbi was. Isn't that right?
Yeah, at least there are sources to that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so hard when you're dealing with ancient. I happen to be in the middle of Mary Beard's wonderful History of Ancient Rome. And she's a meticulous historian, and she says Rome's kept very meticulous records, but still there's so much that one can't know for sure. It seems to me pretty, I won't say inarguable, nothing is inarguable, but it seems pretty clear that Jesus certainly existed. It's hard to know what teachings attributed to him he actually taught and didn't teach. But my own impression, and I certainly don't say this in any way to offend my Christian friends, but my own impression is that Jesus himself was a religious Jew, and did not intend to start a new tradition. But obviously Christianity sees it very differently, as they should, and that's why there's Hanukkah and Christmas. Right. To return to the beginning.
That's right.
That's why you have both.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about it, I mean, we are one faith, the Abrahamic faith, and there are different theological kind of tributaries that come off of that. And actually, I want to go to Abraham, the patriarch of these three great world religions. Not the only religions, but there are three great world. I love the fact that Jews have a word. We Jews make up 0.2% of the world's population, and yet we have a name for the people that aren't Jewish. We call them goyim, which just means nations. It's not like an insult. It just means, but like, can you imagine like people that don't play in the NBA? There's like a name for those people.
I know. It's like when someone says I'm a Gentile. What that means basically is I'm not. I'm part of the other 99 point.
What are the odds?
Whatever percent.
What are the odds
of the world's population, and not you?
Right. Well,
yes.
Yeah. So speaking about Abraham as a man, thinking about his life and just how spectacular his life, whether you believe it literally or figuratively, that there was this character, there was this figure who lived this extraordinary life. And recently I had on a man who's not Jewish, is to the best of my knowledge, Bill Perkins. He's like a former hedge fund trader. He played football in college. He's a very interesting guy. And he wrote a book called Die with Zero. And it's all about basically estate planning. And his thesis, and you can watch this on my YouTube channel, his thesis is that if you die and you basically don't bounce a check to the undertaker or to the rabbi who's giving the hesped, that you are a loser. Basically Alfred Nobel was a loser because for a variety of reasons. You should have used that money when you were younger, or given it to your kids when they were younger, not on your deathbed when you're 120 and they're 90.
I could not possibly agree more. In fact,
I'm going to get you this book then, Rabbi. I'm going to send you a copy of this book.
In almost exactly those words, 2 or 3 days ago to a friend of mine, which is, I don't understand people who die with a lot of money. It's ridiculous. Why would you do that?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you give it to, if you're not going to give it to your children, and hopefully you've taken care of them if you have a lot of money before that, use it for your joy and for charity. Or better, the priority is charity and your joy if you prefer. But I honestly don't understand. And I think that there is a psychological comfort or a psychological reinforcement that people get from seeing just the numbers on the screen, that are their accounts that add up. And I understand that everybody has their own kinds of issues, but I want to say, get over it.
Yeah.
Just get over it. I mean, money can do so much in the world. Why would you want it to sit and just make more money?
Right.
It's the one way that it doesn't do something.
Right. And it's the one way that you can, his thesis is convert money to experiences, and that experiences pay a form of compound interest, which Einstein, as you know, called the greatest invention of the human mind, compounding of interest, because, you know, it gets better and better every day and gets better and better every year, and you always have it to look back on. So another corollary that I've added is, you know, you want to get married young, you want to have kids young, you know, and you want to have as many kids as possible, at least in my case. But the thing that I took away in the comparison with Abraham, it was that he was not stingy. When his wife Sarah died, he went and bought the choicest of the fields. He used the choicest silver. You know, it's like we think now, like, money's fungible. I can use the color of money. Who cares? It's all the same. But he took the best of the money, and there was a distinction back then: good money versus bad money. And he bought this, and then for Isaac, he wanted his son Isaac to marry a wife. And in those days, what would you get the bride's family as a bride price? You'd get them camels. So he gave thousands, millions of dollars worth of 10 camels, a huge number of camels, and spices and ring. And then Isaac married Rebekah. And then later, when he does die, or before he dies, he gets married again and has many more kids.
Yes.
And he sends, and it says very cryptically, it says he sent his kids eastward to the east, to the land of the east. And I just think it's very interesting. Some say those are the lost tribes in India. We know that there are Jews in India for thousands of years. When you think about that, are there lessons, for things like estate planning and other things that we can learn from these stories? And specifically, I want to talk about parenting, because I view the Torah as kind of like, I always say I'd rather have a weatherman or weatherwoman who's wrong all the time than one that's right half the time, because at least you know what to do, not to do. And I want to know, are these examples in the Torah meant to teach us counterexamples, or are they meant to be like role models? We should be like Abraham.
The frustrating answer is both. That is, there are things that the Torah clearly intends to show us by negative example. This is what you ought not to do, right? Lot, for example, offering his daughters to the townspeople. There's no question that the Torah intends us to think this is not a good thing to do. But the fundamental, my own belief is that the fundamental religious orientation in the world is that of gratitude. Mm-hmm. And if you are grateful, you will be generous. If you're not generous, then you're not really grateful, because you're grasping and holding, and you feel like you don't have enough, and you always must have more. And that's not the way, clearly, Abraham led his life, or we should lead our lives. The assumption of religion is not that nothing bad will ever happen. It's that whatever happens, you can cope with it because you have this certainty and strength and gratitude. There's, in fact, a phrase that in I think it's chapter 24, that Abraham was blessed with everything.
Yes.
Abraham bakol.
And he died happy.
And, and when you think about it, he had a very tough life in a lot of ways. He faced famine. He almost lost his child. He sends the other child out of the
His father tried to kill him, right?
Right. So what does it mean that he was blessed with everything? It means that he was blessed with everything, good and bad, light and dark. And that's a life. A life is where, but you have to approach it not as an optimist, not with rose-colored glasses, but with a sense of gratitude and knowing that life will have difficult times and joyous times, and that you will be okay in all times because you are who you are. You're in an image of God.
Right, and being happy with what you have. That's the who is wealthy, right. He who is happy with his lot. Yeah,
exactly. And also, the other part of this about the gratitude piece, which I think that people know, but they don't. Most of us don't know well enough, or don't think about it often enough, is 98% 98% of what we have was given to us. I didn't. Neither you nor I nor the Nobel Prize winners that you're going to talk to, they didn't earn their brains. Had they been born with a less good brain in a different society where it doesn't matter how hard you work or how smart you are, in a different age where it wouldn't matter how hard you work or how smart you are, I live in a house I didn't build, with electricity I didn't create, with a computer that I don't even know how it works, much less built it, and on and on and on and on. Look, almost everything I have was created for me by the efforts of other human beings over the ages and over time. So if you're not grateful, you're blind. And I think to the many blessings.
That's the core. I mean, as I understand it, Hodea is part of Judaism, and we get their name from Judah, and that's what Leah said. I was happy and I rejoiced because I had gratitude. God has given me a child.
That's right.
And so that is the essence of being a Jew. And then the countervailing aspect of it is that the word Israel means to fight with God. So lately my thing has been, I say, I don't know if I believe in God, but I believe in religion, and I believe that everybody has a religion. It's clear to me, even these Nobel Prize winners. And actually, today you're so dead on. I was talking to Ray Weiss. He won the 2017 Nobel Prize. He was born in 1932 in Germany, and he left Germany in 1939. And we know that that's when German Jewry was basically its die was cast. And he was so lucky to come to America, end up in a relatively prosperous part of New York City. He wasn't rich, but then he made his way to MIT, and there were all sorts of barriers against quotas against Jews back then. And he succeeded, and he won the Nobel Prize at age 86. I mean,
I remember, it's like I once read an interview before he died, obviously, with Rabbi, who was a Nobel Prize winner.
Yes, we talked about him today.
And they said to him, tell me, if you had stayed back in the ghetto, what would you have become? And he said, a tailor.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, that's the reality of it. You change someone's circumstance and you change the way that they can. It's quite remarkable. It's quite remarkable how much is given to us.
And when I look at the story, so it's every year on this Sabbath, every Sabbath, Jews read a different section of the Torah. There's basically 52 of them, such that it works out almost 52 of them. So it works out that there's one chapter per week, and that's the Torah reading that you do in the synagogue when we used to meet in synagogue before COVID. And please let us get back to that. And the point being that every week, and including this week, and it's affixed to the lunar calendar. So when this week occurs, this week's Sabbath reading involves Joseph, and it involves the sale of Joseph eventually, which leads to this incredible series of events where the Jews go down to Egypt eventually. But the Torah portion, it's called the Parsha, this chapter basically begins, and it says, Jacob, had moved on after his wife Leah had died. They had their second son together. He had 12 sons and a daughter, and he said he loved Joseph. Joseph was his favorite, and he made Joseph a coat of many colors, the famous Technicolor dream coat.
Right. Exactly.
I think, if I look up, how to create enmity between my kids, I don't think there's a better way to do it than to show favoritism too. And he knew how, the perils of favoritism with his own father-son relationship, and even with his grandfather, who he knew, or at least according to the story. Why would the Torah put in all these flawed, deeply failed figures as fathers and sons and brothers? There's not a good relationship in the Torah. There's one romantic part of Genesis. And I say this just about Genesis. I think it's when Jacob works for 14 years basically, and the Torah says it seemed like went by in an instant because of his love for Rachel. That's like the closest tenderness that you see in the whole Torah.
Also, Leah and Rebecca have a moment of tenderness, and even Abraham at one point says, "I know how beautiful you are," although it's. He says that to Sarah, but you're certainly right that romantic love is not a core of most of the stories of Genesis. Also not a core of most of the stories, most marriage in the ancient world and traditional societies until very recently. Mm-hmm. In fact, marriage was an economic institution, at least as much as it was a romantic institution. And arranged marriages, as you know, in most of the world were quite common and worked reasonably well as such marriages go in terms of sustaining people, although they did not have the option to leave most of the time. And it also has a lot to do with the status of women, which in such societies was publicly very low, and women had to be protected by the institution of marriage. But having said all of that, what I would say is one of the reasons why Judaism is an exegetical tradition and doesn't have a fundamentalist orientation is because the Torah is the first word of the tradition. It's not the only word. And even though it is the most authoritative book, no rabbi ever says, oh, all you need to do to know the answer to this deep question, just open the Torah. It's always what the rabbis say about the Torah.
Right.
Right? It is different from the way, especially Protestantism, sees the Bible, because generally what you hear from rabbis is that they're quoting, as you quoted a minute ago when you said, who is wise? One who's happy with what he has. That's a rabbinic statement from Pirkei Avot. So the things that the Torah doesn't mention explicitly are brought out over the course of generations by interpreters and by midrashists, by people who read into the text. And romantic relationships are very much a part of that.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at the relationships, fraternal relationships, and yes, it is true that Leah and Rachel have a good scene, but then they also have a scene of great tension and vitriol when, there's some sale of some fertilizers.
I could talk about this story a great deal and the stories that follow it. I actually just wrote about them, but
I should point out, Rabbi, before you go on, that Rabbi Wolpe has a wonderful podcast called Off the Pulpit. I listen every week religiously after Sabbath, of course. And then he also, obviously, Sinai Temple, which is co-sponsoring, co-hosting this tonight. They have a wonderful YouTube channel. Please check out the YouTube description here. Want to get as much coverage. And we'll talk maybe briefly about this book, Why Faith Matters, and Making Loss Matter. We'll mention that. But please go on about what you were writing about this week.
I was going to say, I wrote about Jacob and Rachel and Leah, and I started to write a weekly Torah column for the Jerusalem Post, and I was writing about this. And basically the way I would summarize, not what I wrote about, but the larger question you ask is, families are given to dysfunction because human beings compose families. And human beings, when you say, why would a parent make the same mistake that was made to them? Freud wrote about the repetition compulsion, but the truth is the Torah had it thousands of years before Freud. That which was done, and Auden says the same thing, that in his verse about that people generally hurt because they were hurt.
Right, we're victims of victims of victims. I find exactly. That overly dramatic.
It's not always true. Mm-hmm. It is not always true. That's part of the learning curve of generations is to undo what was done. But sometimes it takes a very long time. It isn't done right away. And in fact, the very end of Genesis, the unsung hero of Genesis, is someone named Menashe, who was Joseph's child. And what happens is, for generations, with Isaac and Ishmael, with Jacob and Esau, the older child has lost to the younger child, the brothers and Joseph. And what happens is Jacob blesses Menashe, who's the older, and Ephraim, who's the younger. And he crosses his hands so that he blesses the younger, just like has happened for every generation, with a greater blessing than the older. But Menashe says nothing. For the first time, at the end of the book of Genesis, brothers are finally reconciled. They each get their blessing, but it's okay. And so it does, in the end, teach, but it takes time to get there, and it takes effort, just like it does in life. If I think about what I did 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago,
and so much so that you bring that up about Ephraim and Menashe, that every Friday night the tradition is parents bless their male children that they become like Ephraim and Menashe. And we bless our daughters to be like Leah and Rivka,
Rebecca, Rachel, and
Leah, the matriarchs. And I think it is important, as much as we look down on sort of as a document or historical, that the matriarchs are portrayed in such a better light than the patriarchs. Like you see the matriarchs making really cunning decisions and brilliant stratagems throughout, and you see kind of the patriarchs kind of bumbling, worried that their wives will be, set upon by kings of Egypt, and the women are just very strong and very developed characters.
As a gross generalization about life, in the many years as a rabbi that I have observed human beings, I think that you have to say that emotional wisdom is generally more prevalent among women than among men. It just is. Now, obviously, there are a billion different individual exceptions. Yeah. But as a general rule, women develop faster. They, I think, are more acute, more sensitive to emotional registers. That's just how it is. Yeah,
that's the only thing, maybe I fault the Reform community with, is that they delay the onset of the age of majority for girls to the age of majority for boys. I always felt that was regressive. In other words, in Orthodox Judaism, or in maybe even conservative too, I actually don't know. When do girls have their bat mitzvah?
Different people do it different times.
But in Orthodox, it's always when they're 12, girls are 12, and boys are 13. In Reform, it's always when both are 13. And I feel like that's punishing. I wouldn't want to punish my daughters if they're more emotionally mature. As you say, I mean, it's just true. You see, there's huge differences between my daughters and my sons. It's just denying the facts of life. But I want to get into some questions. We only have a few more minutes. Some people are asking some good questions. I want to make sure that we ask them. So one question I always wanted to know is about. Well, actually, this has to do with. Yes, what is this notion of dreams that occurs in the Torah, in the book of Genesis particularly? We see Jacob having a dream of a ladder with angels going up. We see Joseph having a dream, and then he has many dreams about the Pharaoh, about the cows and so forth. Why is dreaming so endemic in the book of Genesis?
So I would say two quick things. One is that dreams are in the Bible are considered messages. It's clear that God is communicating in one way or another, both with Jacob and Joseph. They prove to be prophetic dreams. Abraham also has dreams, although it's not as noticed. And the other thing about Joseph that's particularly beautiful is Joseph has dreams about himself and his brothers, and they hate him for it, that his brothers bow down to him. He ends up, doesn't matter how, he ends up in prison in Egypt. There he interprets the dream of the cupbearer and baker. And then the cupbearer, when he is restored to his position, tells Pharaoh. Joseph interprets the dreams of Pharaoh and becomes viceroy to Pharaoh in Egypt. So the question is, Joseph falls by dream and he rises by dreams. What's the difference? And the difference very beautifully was said by a rabbi a generation ago. He said, Joseph falls when he can only listen to his own dreams. Mm-hmm. He rises when he starts to listen to the dreams of others as well. And so I think that that's also a subtlety that the Torah wants us to understand, that you're not the only person who has dreams. Everybody's always talking about follow your dreams. Listen to other people's dreams too. I mean, you're not only supposed to listen to your own.
Right. And it's a saying pilots have as well. You have to learn from others' mistakes because you won't live long enough to make them all yourself. Question from our listener, Boo Rida, interesting name, and he or she is asking, could I ask you, Rabbi, how do you interpret the COVID pandemic in a religious sense? Maybe is this meant to teach us something? Do we?
First of all, I think this is somebody who's read To Kill a Mockingbird. But second, I'm a deep believer in randomness. I think that God created the world with randomness for a very good reason, obviously. But I don't interpret things like the COVID pandemic in spiritual or religious terms, except in terms of our response. But when people say that God sent the plague because people are bad or so on, I don't believe that for a second. There are lots and lots of reasons why I don't believe it. But here's why I would say that the world is random, in part, because if, in fact, good people always had good things happen to them, and bad people always had bad things happen to them,
right,
then you would be good just so that bad things won't
If
happen.
you were rational,
that has
yeah.
no moral content.
Right.
Exactly. It would be like, it would be the rational bet. So there have to be unpredictable things that we react to in moral ways. And I think the pandemic has revealed the reactions of various people in ways that are better and worse. And I'm going to let you figure out who was better and who was worse. I'm not going to go into that right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I've been talking a lot to people in the kind of self-help sphere of life. I'm talking to psychologists and so forth. And I noted that, like, I made a joke that, if you search on Google, you can search trends. So you can search Rabbi David Wolpe, and then you can see over time how popular has that been as a Google search term. Google Trends, and of course it peaks, when you were born, or it starts when you were born, and it keeps rising like a hockey stick, right? But then I Googled, like, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, and then I said, well, what words, happen? What words are most likely to occur before the words "it was the best thing that ever happened to me"? And it's pretty much like, I got fired, or I failed, or I lost the World Series, whatever. And that was the best. Like, we get taught so much more viscerally, and it might just be a symptom of the human condition. Like, no other animals are like that. Like, well, we were starved to death, and then all of a sudden, like, we grew another claw. Like, it doesn't happen. Why do you think that is unique to human experience?
I don't know. There's a beautiful phrase from a Talmudic rabbi that the eye has a light part and a dark part, but you can only see through the dark part. There is absolutely something in struggle and difficulty and failure that teaches us more than ease and success.
Yeah.
That is certainly true.
I want to end with the 3 questions that I ask all my guests, of course, which is, can you first provide for us a 6-equation long theory of everything that unifies quantum gravity with the 3 stronger forces of the nuclear and electric?
I of course I can, but I fear that if I take the thunder away from your Nobel Prize winning guests, they'll start transgressing on my territory. So I want to modestly.
Okay, fair enough. Yes. Yeah, I thought you were going to say the margin isn't big enough for me to include it. Okay, now my serious question that I do ask all my guests is, what would you put in your zava'ah? And so for listeners that aren't familiar, a zava'ah is this concept of an ethical will, first tracing back to a chapter in Genesis that's coming up when Jacob gathered his 12 sons to offer them a blessing and predict their future. And nowadays it's not only for Jews. Alfred Nobel left a material will, but also an ethical will that these creations and inventions should make the world better. And that was part of the requirement for winning the Nobel Prize. When I ask you, Rabbi, what would you put in your ethical will?
So I would say the 2 things that strike me immediately is that the 2 most important qualities of character that someone has to have are, first of all, to be kind. I think that kindness is crucial to human life. And second, to have stamina. That is, the things that are worth doing in this world don't get done in an instant. And you will be discouraged and you will fail and you have to keep at them, because if they really matter and they're really worth doing, then you keep at them. And of course, if it were my ethical will, I would also say to anybody who was my offspring that there is wisdom and richness in your tradition and in your people, and I hope that you are faithful to them and that you pass that tradition on to your children.
Yeah, I would say that even to people that aren't your biological children, but your ideological children, and that I think it's worth investigating the faith of your birth. I think, unless it was particularly abusive, obviously you can't speak in every case, but coming back to Judaism after learning so much about Catholicism and feeling such warmth. I spoke, recently at a Catholic university, not recently, earlier this year, and learning a lot about it. But it also makes you deepen your appreciation for your own tradition, and life is short, and I think that's a big lesson. And so I agree that at least taking it seriously. That's what I said earlier. I believe I embody this as a scientist, to wrestle with God, to fight with God. The other name for Jews, Israel, means wrestle with or fight with God. I believe I do that, and it makes my my sort of, it strengthens the richness of my life, I would say. Okay, second question, Rabbi, goes to a science.
You already asked me two.
Oh, no. Well, no, I can ask you three.
The first one didn't count.
The first one was 0. No, that one, well, you kind of swung and missed, but anyway, we're not gonna. That'll be for your third episode.
Okay.
We'll give you a couple of weeks to publish that theory of everything. Okay, you've probably seen 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yes.
Stanley Kubrick's wonderful film.
But I remember it somewhat.
Yeah. Well, you might remember this iconic scene where these primates discover this obelisk, this monolith, this thing that's kind of menacing, and it's unclear what it is, but it later is found on the moon, or another one is found on the moon, and it's obviously meant to be discovered when humanity is ready, technologically or otherwise, to discover this. I asked this of Ann Druyan, who is the widow of the late, great Carl Sagan. And I said, what would you put on a time capsule that would last 1 billion years, like one of these monoliths? And she said, well, I actually already did that. I said, oh, yeah? And she had made a recording of her brainwaves when she first fell in love with Carl Sagan, and NASA put that on a plaque and launched it on the Voyager satellite, and it's made of solid gold. If anybody finds it, please return to me. But it's made of solid gold, and it will last for 1 billion years, NASA engineers say. So it's a time capsule. And she said, I asked her, what would you put on it? And she said, act humbly, love mercy, and act justly, or something like.
To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Although if she said walk humbly with your God, I'd be surprised.
She did not say that. She left that off. So the quote from Mika.
That's probably as good as you could do.
Yeah. So what would you put on your monolith? Would you put anything specifically? It doesn't have to be about religion or anything deep, but what sort of very interesting fact about the existence of Earth, if you will, would you most like some other civilization to know about? I was here, or we were here.
I think that probably this is profoundly unoriginal, but probably in order for them, I don't know if it would fit in a monolith, but in order for them to understand who we are, I would either choose, a soliloquy from Shakespeare, a section of the Torah, or maybe a symphony of Beethoven's. In other words, something that is the supreme product of who we are and what we can produce, and let that speak for itself, knowing that whatever we put will be misinterpreted and misunderstood because it'll be 1 million years from now.
Yeah.
So that's why I incline to music as opposed to words.
Yeah, they did put music. They actually recorded Chuck Berry, I think, and something else. But it's good they put it on that, not like a USB drive. Like, here's an MP3 file. That's not going to be too useful.
I mean, if you want to. If you're not going to put Beethoven, then at least put Sinatra.
I actually had one of my guests, he's not a scientist, he wrote a book about artificial meat, of all things, Chase Purdy, and he said he'd put the collective works of Stephen Sondheim. So you're in good company, Rabbi.
I would absolutely. I think Sondheim, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It's one of the supreme products.
All right. The last question also involves Sir Arthur C. Clarke, and it goes the opposite direction. We've asked about your future heirs ideologically and biologically with your ethical will. We talked about 1 billion-year time capsule into the future, but now I want to go backwards. So the name of this podcast is the Into the Impossible podcast, and it's one of Sir Arthur's 3 famous laws. The first one being any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, to which Michael Shermer, who I believe you know well, said something like any sufficiently advanced civilization is indistinguishable from God or aliens. I forget exactly what Shermer's law is. And then his second law of Arthur C. Clarke is for every expert, there's an equal and opposite expert. I think you could say rabbi. For any rabbi, there's an equal and opposite. Absolutely. But his last statement was, the only way of discovering the limits of what is possible is to go beyond them into the impossible. And that's sort of our catchphrase here. And I want to ask you, kind of in a sense of advice to your former self, what would you tell a 20-year-old David Wolpe before he was a rabbi? What kind of advice, something that seemed mystifying, stymieing, intimidating, menacing, perhaps, that because you had courage and you've overcome a lot in your life, we haven't had much time to talk about the things that you've personally overcome, but let's just say, what would you tell a 20-year-old version of yourself to do to go into the impossible for the benefit of the future version of you?
I think that I would say the same thing that I say to younger people that I've learned, which is that that your anxieties about the future and your lack of assurance about yourself in the present will dissolve. So why not dissolve them now? That is, if you can accelerate the process of having confidence in yourself so that you don't have to do it in 10 or 20 or 30 years, you will be astonished at almost all of your regrets will be about things that you didn't have the assurance and the calm to do. So do them. Do them. You will be, and the other thing that I would say, which is the same message in a way, but different, is when people tell you don't be afraid to fail, failing hurts. But the amazing thing about being hurt is you don't die of an emotion. So go into the pain of failure and being hurt and discover how actually powerful you are, that you can feel it and still go on. And that, I mean, I think the indispensable quality to lead a good life is courage.
Interesting. Well, Rabbi, you have a lot of courage, and I want to thank you for your generosity of time and spirit. Where can people find you online or elsewhere?
I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. Or just if you Google Rabbi Wolpe, you'll find me and find how to get in touch with me and find books, columns, all the paraphernalia. Your
next book will be, the Twitter Torah, because you are a master. You have a rapier-sharp tweeting finger and thumb. Rabbi, I want to thank you. I'll give you some applause now here. Thank you so much. I want to wish you a wonderful Hanukkah Hag Sameach, full of light like you give to the world. And I want to wish you strength and health. And I hope that we'll talk in our next holiday episode, maybe Purim or Tu B'Shvat. I'm going to get you for all the holidays, Rabbi, until you get sick of me.
Enjoy it. Thank you so much.
Bye, Rabbi. Happy Hanukkah. And I'll take us out with a clip from our good friend Miguel Tully, who runs Yeti Tears, and he's written a wonderful song which will take us out on this Hanukkah edition of the Into the Impossible podcast. Happy Hanukkah, everybody, wherever you may be. Continue lighting a light of good and extinguish the darkness. As they say, only light can extinguish the darkness. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening wherever you may be. Stay tuned for another episode coming up next week on the Into the Impossible podcast, where we'll be getting you sick of Nobel Prize winning intellects. Good night for now. Bye-bye. Thank you, Rabbi.